Netherborne, the Ancient Devourer. Chapter 71. Enlisting an Ancient's Help. Zamrus Arknight could hardly recognize the grand dungeon's first floor as he flew out of the stone tunnel and was greeted by an endless meadow of lush grass with the occasional outcropping of white trees. Usually, the dragons would gather around the floor tower in the far distance, but with most of the eggs destroyed, there was little need for that now. Ever since the prison break and the subsequent hunt on the elusive necromancer that had netted the dragons a hefty loss, a grim mood was all that could be found here. Dragon corpses that had been turned undead were piled off to the side, some burned, others chained down for research purposes. Zamrus let out a sigh of regret as he flew by. The dragons hadn't suffered a loss in 1,000 years, and when a dragon's pride was hurt, they chose to blame others rather than themselves. Because the Arknight and Arksnow family lost the most dragons to this conflict with the necromancer, they were seen as the weak link. Which was true. The loss of many family members to the necromancer's clutches caused both families to plummet down the social hierarchy. As a result, other smaller families seized the opportunity to finally look down on those who had been above them for generations. Locating a group of senior dragons like himself gathered in a circle, Zamrus cleared his mind and gathered his courage. Despite having a few elders in the family, the loss of many hatchlings and seniors left the future of the Arknight family looking grim. Zamrus. An orange-scaled dragon a bit larger than himself sneered as he landed beside him. Glad a member of the Arknight family could finally join us. Still think you can show up late? A few months ago, an Arc Flame would never dare talk to an Arknight in such a manner. The Arc Flame dragon still had to be careful with his words since there was an ancient ancestor in the Arknight family, something the Arc Flame family lacked. But the Arknight ancient, like most ancient dragons, was fast asleep to preserve their lifespan. Only a few ancients were active, such as Hyveth Arkspace, but she mostly kept to herself and rarely interacted with the other dragons, choosing to sleep on her private island and operate the rainbow roads. Zamrus ignored the obvious taunts and nonchalantly replied, "Glad to be here, Zekis." As he looked around the group, he saw a beautiful dragon from the Arksnow family, but her head was hung low out of shame. The standing of her family had already been poor, and the loss of nearly all her brothers and sisters to the necromancer on the 50th floor had reduced their status to the lowest of the 12 noble dragon families. Zekis huffed and moved backward a bit, accidentally knocking over a tree as he went as if it was a mere weed. "Arkwing suck up," he grumbled, and Zamrus ignored the bumbling fool. Of course, any family in their right mind would suck up to the royal family. The Arkwings were simply too powerful. Vipa lumbered forward and snarled, "Quiet down, you two." Zamrus recognized her as a dragon from the Arksky family based on her sky blue scales. However, her body was much more robust, which matched her overbearing demeanor. "We were asked by the Arkwing family to analyze the shift in mana while they investigated the strange red light in the sky." Zekis looked like he wanted to refute, but a glare from Zamrus made him grumble and stay silent. Zamrus apologized for his tardiness, explaining that he had accompanied the prince. This earned him an eye roll from Zekis. "I'm not caught up on the situation," Zamrus continued, his tongue flicking out to taste the air. The mana does indeed have a slightly different taste. It seems denser than usual. This has to be because of the necromancer," the Arksnow beauty said through gritted teeth. "Everything is because of that lunatic." Zamrus had to agree to that assessment. Ever since the report of food going missing in the lowlands, the way dragons had lived for thousands of years had been shaken. Much to the fury of the Arkwings, who wanted to maintain the status quo. Since Verpa Arksky was a member of the most prestigious family here, she led the discussions. A few human slaves testified that they were notified of a demon lord's arrival right as the sky's red light appeared. Therefore, I believe this shift in mana is also due to this supposed demon lord's arrival. Zamrus's eyes went wide. Most dragons looked down on the system, but they kept a few human slaves for this very purpose. In the past, whenever a void creature entered the world, the system would fight back by designating it as a demon lord. Since the dragons weren't part of this system, they never bothered to intervene except for those few times the void creature came too close to their territory. Zamrus was lost in thought when a sudden wave of dread overcame him. At first, the feeling was subtle, but soon all the senior dragons were looking around curiously with twisted faces, as if they were uncomfortable. Verpa asked, "Where is that coming from?" Zamrus, unfortunately, did not have an answer. As they looked down, they saw the grass start to sway oddly, and then the ground began to tremble. At first, the movements were subtle, but they quickly worsened. Recognizing the danger, all 5 of the senior dragons launched themselves into the sky. Zamrus looked to the side and saw the Arc Snow dragon. Sadly, he didn't know her name as he had deemed the Arc Snow family unworthy of his attention in the past. She turned to him with concern all over her face, which looked cute with her snow-white scales. The Arc Snow dragon looked at the trembling ground in fear and asked, "What was that?" Before anyone could answer, the ground exploded, and something titanic surged upward. Zamrus managed to dive to the side in time, but the Arc Snow dragon was the monster's target. She attempted to summon an ice storm to slow the beast down, but it had little effect. Zamrus watched in horror as the dragon was consumed by a column of black scales and neon green flesh that seemed comparable in size to the floor's tower. All 4 of the remaining senior dragons hurled spells at the monster. "How does it move so fast?" Zekis roared as flames exploded from his mouth, taking out a large chunk of the beast's side. However, the wound seemed insignificant compared to the monster's overall size. A claw of shadows materialized in front of Zamrus, and he tore out a large chunk of the monster's flesh. Neon green and black blood sprayed everywhere, but the wound quickly healed as the flesh knitted itself together and the plates regenerated. Zamrus wanted to get closer and attack more directly, but waves of death affinity mana were wearing on his magical defenses. This meant that he couldn't get too close or expend too much mana on a single attack. The monster's head seemed to reach the top of the dome as it changed directions and began plummeting to the ground. From this angle, Zamrus got a look at its face. An abyss of razor-sharp teeth dyed in blood. Verpa shot a jet of high-pressured water from her mouth, knocking out several hundred human-sized teeth from the titanic monster's mouth. The monster let out a scream of pain and rage and began to target Verpa. Fortunately, the worm-like creature's mobility was greatly reduced when half its body was out of the ground, allowing Verpa to easily dodge its pursuit. Though it chased her around for a while, the creature never displayed any ranged attacks or magical abilities. However, its speed, size, and ability to regenerate made it a formidable opponent. Verpa shouted, "Zamrus! Get an elder or ancient. We can't deal with this threat. It heals everything we do." As much as it hurt Zamrus's pride, Verpa was right. They had only been hatchlings 100 years ago, and although the title of senior sounded important and came with a great sense of pride, it was ultimately nothing compared to the true monsters of this world. "All right. Hang tight!" Zamrus shouted back before flying off toward the tunnel. The monster seemed uninterested in him and continued to chase Verpa with furious determination. Zamrus wondered if the creature was even intelligent, but he didn't have time to dwell on it. He quickly made his way through the stone tunnel and past the prison, putting as much distance between himself and the monster as possible. When Zamrus reached the top of the stairs, he was greeted by an eerie silence that permeated the normally bustling hall. The absence of the elders, who would typically be deep in discussion of arcane magic, confirmed his suspicions that something was amiss. The arrival of the Demon Lord had clearly shaken the elders. As Zamrus ventured out, he was greeted by the sight of a vast forest with many floating islands looming overhead, each covered in dragon-size architecture. Waterfalls cascaded down from some of the islands, filling lakes that flowed into streams. These waterways flowed through the lowlands, providing fresh water for the many monsters and human cities in the area. The beauty of the landscape took Zamrus's breath away no matter how many times he saw it. "Something the matter, Zamrus?" Zamrus looked up and saw an enchanting woman lazily hovering in the air. She was around 2 meters tall, and her inhuman sapphire eyes, which shone like gemstones, casually watched Zamrus as if he were a lost bug. She could have easily deceived anyone into thinking she was human. However, her long, flowing magenta hair, which writhed around her shoulders like snakes, and the golden horn on her head clearly showed that she was no human but rather an ancient dragon in human form. Hyvathark's pace, yes, there is a problem. Zamrus clenched his teeth as he saw the woman sneer at him with contempt, her gemstone eyes filled with disdain. A monster far too strong for us senior dragons to deal with has appeared on the Grand Dungeon's first floor, he said, his voice quivering with fear. Zamrus hung his head, avoiding Hyvatha's piercing gaze as she loomed over him. It has already killed an Arx no. Oh my, Hyvath said nonchalantly, inspecting her perfectly manicured nails. Does your little ragtag group require my assistance? She floated down gracefully, and Zamrus kept his eyes fixed on the ground, his heart pounding with fear. Hyvath put a delicate finger under Zamrus's chin and forced him to look her in the eye. Then beg me. She grinned wickedly, revealing a row of sharp, shark-like teeth that starkly contrasted her ethereal beauty. Beg me like the weak dog you are. Please. Zamrus's claws scraped against the stone floor as he struggled to contain his silent rage. Please help us. Okay. Since you asked so nicely. Hyvath clapped her hands, and the world around them twisted and contorted as she used her mastery of space manipulation to transport them to their desired location. Despite the chaos of the warped space around them, Hyvath remained composed, her sapphire eyes shining with excitement as they arrived. Purple lightning crackled between the two of them, and a sky-blue dragon corpse came tumbling toward them with a hole through its stomach. Hyvath frowned, and with a flick of her wrist, the two of them switched locations, appearing a few hundred meters away. They watched as Verpa's lifeless body slammed into the ground in a cloud of vaporized blood. Hyvath gazed into the distance, following the trajectory of Verpa, and locked eyes with a void creature standing next to a golden dragon she recognized. Well, that's interesting, she said with a mysterious smile. Chapter 72. Weak Links. As Victor arrived at the top floor of the Grand Dungeon, he immediately spotted Wiggles in the far distance. His pet's titanic body took up the skyline, chasing a blue blob that Victor realized was a dragon. They were over 1,000 meters into the sky, and Wiggles seemed to struggle to catch the annoying fly in his gaping maw. The dragon drew Wiggles up high into the sky before dive-bombing toward the ground, causing Wiggles to roar in rage as his snack escaped. Need a hand? Victor chuckled as he raised his hand, purple lightning arcing between his gold-tinted claws as he prepared his Doom Ray spell. The distance and speed of the dragon made aiming a little hard, meaning Victor had to wait right before the dragon reached the ground and would have to waste a second changing direction. Once the moment arrived, he unleashed the Doom Ray, and a thunderclap accompanied the purple lightning, lashing out and covering thousands of meters instantly, striking the blue dragon square in the chest, sending it flying. As Victor lowered his claw, he felt a sudden pressure upon him, as if someone of equal strength was glaring at him. Looking around, thanks to his incredible eyesight, he saw two figures off to the side. He recognized them both. One was a very tall woman with magenta hair, inhuman crystal eyes, and a single curved golden horn on her head. Then towering over her was a house-size black dragon, but despite the size difference, the dragon's presence paled compared to the woman, who was like a black hole of pure power. All the mana in the near vicinity seemed to gravitate to her. Hyvathark's pace, we finally meet. To Victor, this dragon in human form had shown him what the peak of power was in this world. He was glad she enlightened him so early on. Otherwise, his demise may have come far sooner than expected due to his arrogance. Victor could feel Alice and Genus tense up beside him as they heard his words. Alice's breathing quickened as she frantically looked around. Hyvath? Was she expecting us? I don't know. Victor wasn't sure if she even saw them. Do you think she would be open to negotiations, Genus? He hated to admit it, but Hyvath scared him. He was confident that he could survive any attack, but if she did the same trick she used on Terry and he ended up on some foreign and desolate world, he had no idea what he would do. Genus groaned. Out of all the dragons, she is impossible to reason with. The likelihood she would even let you speak in her presence is zilch. While the group discussed Hyveth, Wiggles seemed bored now that its prey was dead, but it was happy to spot two new juicy targets that were helpfully standing still. Surging toward them, Wiggles parted the ground like the Red Sea, trees flew like toothpicks, lakes became temporary waterfalls on the side of a newly formed Grand Canyon, and the earth trembled for miles. Zamrus watched the approaching calamity with some fear, especially with the fresh memory of it devouring the Ark's no beauty in such a brutal way. Meanwhile, Hyveth Ark's pace furrowed her brows. "Vile bug dares to approach me." She raised her hand, and when Wiggles was only a mile away, with a click of her fingers, space folded. Wiggles' mouth and end became one as space compressed Wiggles into a pancake. Black blood and neon green venom exploded out of the floating pancakes, and the sickening sound of crushed bones echoed through the land for miles. Hyveth then closed her hand into a fist. Mana cracked and ripped as the undead pancake thousands of meters across was crushed into a ball as if a black hole had appeared. Then, like discarding a toy, Hyveth carelessly flicked her finger, and as if the crushed ball had been hit by a supercharged bullet, it flew across the entire floor until it smashed into the dungeon's wall. While Hyveth had been busy with Wiggles, Victor hadn't been idle. Two doom rays, at around 10% of his potential power, crackled between his claws. Then, raising his arms at Hyveth, he unleashed both bolts of lightning, causing the entire floor to go white with light, blinding everyone foolish enough to look on. Victor knew he had to play to his race's strengths to win this battle. Although he could attack from range, his stealth and assassin capabilities far outweighed his ranged options, so before the light faded, he vanished with stealth. Sensing the attack, Hyveth turned on her heel and raised her two hands. A portal appeared. It looked like a crack in the air had formed, and through it was a zoomed-in video of where Victor had just been floating. The two lightning bolts crashed into the rift and went through, reappearing back where he had been and smashing into the ground, causing a superheated explosion. As the dust settled, Alice was floating in the sky, Henry had dashed off to the side, and Genus lay on the edge of the charred crater with a few wounds. Hyveth narrowed her inhuman crystal eyes in slight confusion at the sudden disappearance of Victor. Unknown to her, Victor was racing toward her at his top speed across the flat meadow. However, Hyveth hadn't become an ancient dragon and lived thousands of years without ever learning the art of warfare. So although that lightning attack lacked the punch required to shatter her rifts, she may have died if it had hit her directly. "A more formidable necromancer than I anticipated," Hyveth said to Zamrus over her shoulder. "Little dragon, leave now unless you wish to die." She flashed him a crooked smile. "The truly strong in this world only fear one thing, a weak link." As if to prove her point, Hyveth stepped forward and vanished. Space warped and broke as she reappeared next to Genus many miles away. Zamrus suddenly felt a wave of dread similar to the titanic earthworm's death affinity mana. "Don't move," an ancient voice said as Zamrus felt something cold on his neck. The claw was over a meter long, and in the corner of his eye, Zamrus could see its golden tint. Victor had his annihilating aura on, which relentlessly assaulted the dragon's magical defenses, meaning Zamrus could choose between defending himself from instant death or conjuring a suicide spell. However, no magic defense could protect against Victor's claw at this range. Since assimilating with the world core, his body no longer feared mana, so he could easily shred through mana-based defenses. Zamrus gulped and felt the claw scratch against his neck as he swallowed. "Are you the necromancer that killed everything in the lowlands?" he tried to say without stuttering. "So what if I am?" The creature seemed amused. Rage bloomed in the dragon's chest. The creature that had slaughtered so many of his brothers and sisters and caused his family's downfall was right behind him, and he was powerless to do anything. Zamrus could not remember a day more humiliating than today, and he vowed that if he survived, he would soar to greater heights than ever before. Victor wanted to continue humoring the dragon, but he had to focus on Hyveth. The dragoness had teleported beside Genus and locked him in a spatial bubble. Despite the thousands of meters that separated the two, Victor could see her cold eyes. A miscalculation then. This dragon isn't important to her. Tisk should have known. Dragons only care for themselves. It appears you aren't valued. Victor activated spirit movement on his claw. With his body's weakness to mana gone, his claw easily passed through the dragon's mana shield. In the past, when he had tried to bypass a dragon's mana shield, it had felt like putting his hand in boiling water, but now it felt like nothing. Wait! Wait, please! Zamrus felt the creature's claws caressing his brain. It felt like a ghost was inside him, making Zamrus shudder. The dragon slowly lowered his body to the ground in a submissive position. My family has become weak, and I despise the current rulers. I would be happy to serve under. Zamrus seemed to choke on the last words as if he had consumed some vile vegetables. Your Excellency! Please spare my life. Victor honestly didn't give two shits about this dragon. It was clearly worthless as a hostage and seemed to lack a spine. But having only undead dragons would get tiresome. So I might as well keep a few around. Maybe the dragon would even try to flee and lead me to more dragons to kill. Who knows? If you are still in this position when I defeat Hyveth, then I will spare your pathetic life, he decreed and removed his hand from the dragon's brain. He almost thought he heard Zamrus quietly scoff at his declaration. Victor didn't blame the dragon. Hyveth was a monster on the level of a demigod, and even he was uncertain if she could be beaten, but he had to try. Victor looked back across the meadow and caught an interesting sight. It appeared Hyveth was going to kill Genus, likely for betraying dragonkind, but the golden dragon flashed with golden light before vanishing. He could hardly contain a smirk. It seemed the floor teleportation access could override a spatial locking spell from Hyveth. That was good to know. With her prisoner escaping her clutches, Victor saw a hint of irritation in the woman's expression. Her lips curved up and showed tips of shark-like teeth. Alice had flown a bit away, which meant nothing as Hyveth appeared right next to her, standing in midair without issue. Child! Why do you collude with such a creature? Her tone was cold. Do you not know of their kind? They are world destroyers. Good. Alice smiled. Because so am I. Void mana swirled around her body, and within a second, she was wearing her void form skill. It was like a suit of armor made entirely out of the void. Hyveth hissed, a voidling, how repulsive! Alice screamed as if she had just plunged into a pot of boiling water. Then shadowy steam evaporated off her shoulders, similar to what Victor used to suffer from. It seemed the world was fighting her existence. Was this the drawback of her void form skill? Was this the pain Victor would have felt if not for his lack of pain and dulled emotions? Silence! Hyveth snapped with irritation. With a flick of her hand, gravity increased tenfold around Alice. However, she remained floating. Hyveth frowned and decided to finish the voidling in one strike. For the first time, Hyveth chanted the draconic language rather than just using simple hand gestures. Victor had reactivated his stealth and was rushing over. He was only 100 meters away when Hyveth finished her spell. It was hard to hear Hyveth's chanting over Alice's incoherent screams, but the chaotic mana was a telltale sign the spell was near completion. Plane shift, Hyveth muttered as the top half of Alice stopped flowing with the planet's inertia and the bottom half kept going. Chapter 73. Reality check. Victor felt immense pain as if his leg had been snapped in half. The dungeon shuddered, the walls that had seemed impenetrable with enough mana running through them to form a small star began to crack and groan. Hyveth Arcspace, an ancient dragon with domain over space, grunted as purple runic circles spun around her arms at varying speeds. Her inhuman crystal eyes shone with light, and she clenched her shark-like teeth. Throughout the chaos of the situation, Alice continued screaming. At first, Victor was worried that she was shrieking due to Hyveth's spell, but within seconds it became apparent that wasn't the case. The world was shifting as if a line had been drawn through the middle. The top half tried to remain stationary, while the bottom continued moving with the planet's rotation. But Alice was fine if screaming and evaporating in real time was considered fine. Alice remained suspended in midair, unaffected by the laws of physics in either of the two planes of reality she occupied. It was as if she was not even part of this plane of existence, leading one to wonder if this world was merely two-dimensional to her and if she existed in a third dimension. Victor had assumed her void form was simply void armor, similar to how she used Mana's shield in the past to shroud her body in a suit of darkness. But perhaps that wasn't the case. Alice had become the void, much like himself. Is she burning stat points per second as well? Is that why she's screaming? Victor was unsure, but he needed to end this fight quickly. Hyveth faltered slightly, leaning to the side as if winded. However, her arms remained raised with purple rings of runic formations spinning around. Some were the size of a bracelet, the ones further out took up a couple meters and spun faster. Victor came up behind Hyveth. Despite all her power, she couldn't see through his maxed-out stealth skill. If even she can't detect me, then can I hide from the gods themselves, assuming they exist? He loomed behind Hyveth Ark's pace. The chaotic spatial mana surrounding her made space compress and expand randomly. But Victor was unaffected, able to pass through the distorted space with ease. Well, this confirms that void creatures are unaffected by space. He raised his claw and thrust toward Hyveth's head. As he touched her skin, his stealth deactivated, and Hyveth instantly vanished, reappearing a few meters away while clutching her neck. Blood seeped through her fingers, and she glared at Victor with wrathful eyes. Finally, the draconic spell cancelled out. Victor felt the pain subside as the dungeon stopped consuming copious amounts of mana to resist breaking under Hyveth's spell and began repairing itself. So I am not only the demon core, but the dungeon has become an extension of my body? That made Victor shudder. The idea of people running around inside his body and casting spells felt weird. Hyveth brought her pale, blood-stained hand in front of her face and stared at it in disbelief. You hurt me. Her hand started shaking as if attempting to suppress an uncontrollable rage. How? I have not received so much as a mere scratch in the last 1,000 years. She gnashed her teeth. I have gazed at the stars and know the nature of your kind. You are destroyers, bringers of destruction. She hissed, all I see beyond the veil of this world are dead, lifeless planets floating in the cold expanse of space orbiting harvested stars. Although Hyveth was tall in her human form, she still had to look up at Victor's face, which loomed over everything. Victor's eyes were swirling orbs of pure gold, and his many gold-tinted lethal claws hung lazily at his side. I have not come to destroy. His ancient voice, a chorus of 1,000 souls, echoed through the land. The world and its denizens force this role upon me. They pin the role of demon lord on my back and wonder why I fight back. Lies. All you speak of are lies. Hyveth straightened up, and the wound on her neck sealed. I have faced your kind before many times over the millennia. Every time the citizens of the world, dragons included, have had no option except to flee as your kind wreaked destruction. Hyveth clenched her hand. Do you know why I became this strong? Why I don't sleep for centuries to extend my life like the other ancients? She stepped forward, and the world quivered. More runic rings sprung to life and began rotating around her arms. I know what's coming. There may not be a tomorrow or next year. The distant worlds are evidence of this inevitable truth. Some lasted a long time, but they all fell, eventually. I watched it with my own eyes, the slow death of the universe to the disease of your kind. Victor shook his head. I know not of the distant worlds, but my creator had one goal, to incite hate upon me to gain a foothold on this world. The rifts will come soon, Hyveth. This world is already doomed, like the others you speak of. He reached out a claw. Unless you join me, then we can face this threat together. Do you take me for a fool? Hyveth roared. Gained a bit of sentience, and now you think you can trick ageless dragons such as myself? I will not fall for your nefarious schemes. I only kill those that oppose my rule. Under me, the world will be safe." The words died in Victor's non-existent throat as he realized how selfish and self-centered they were. No wonder Hyveth struggled to believe his words when he sounded like an unreasonable dictator. But despite their meaning, they were the truth. He had gone too deep down the rabbit hole and was now stuck with no way out. Hyveth sneered at his words. "Everyone on this planet has been doing just fine for thousands of years. Are we perfect? No. Do we wage wars and kill each other? Sure. But at least the world is teeming with life, not a floating rock of nothingness like the lifeless worlds consumed by the void." She was right. Victor's words were the equivalent of an alien race landing on Earth and demanding that all humans fall under their tyrannical rule. Unfortunately, Victor had become that alien. He knew of the consequences and threats that faced this planet and its people and believed he was the only one that could save it, even though he was the one that brought doom upon them in the first place. But was a tyrannical rule the only way? It might be possible if the dragons weren't so hard-headed, but was their relationship irreparable at this point? He had slaughtered and enslaved over 100 dragons by now and had even wiped out an entire generation of dragon eggs. Just how terrible had he been? He had just told Hyveth with a straight face that he came in peace and not for destruction, yet all he had done was destroy and kill without remorse. "I even made them fight against their own kind by raising their children as undead. Hell, I even drove Genus to become a cannibal to survive as we delved into the dungeon's depths. Do you even care for life?" Hyveth jeered. "Are there any emotions swirling around in that shadowy body of yours? Are you even alive?" Victor paused. It was easy to put everything up to circumstance. He had picked an undead creature to be reincarnated as. Therefore he would have dulled emotions and a natural aversion to the living, but what was the definition of being alive? He may be undead, but if his stat points reached 0, he would cease to exist, just like a mortal human reaching the end of their lifespan. "I am a living creature, am I not?" As Victor debated what to say, Alice's screams reached a new high, and void spells suddenly appeared randomly around her in droves. Ice bolts that looked like black lines that tore through reality began firing out in random directions. Finally, hellfire exploded, and everything the purple flames touched was deleted from existence for miles around. Hyveth was a blur as she teleported, avoiding the void bolts with inhuman precision and speed. On the other hand, Victor could stand there deathly still as the void bolts simply joined his own body. He stared at his clenched hand, how the light reflected off his lethal claws that had scratched an ancient dragon mere moments ago. Victor snapped out of it and flew toward Alice. With Hyveth on the run, he finally had space to tend to her. "Hey, Alice," he shouted, but she ignored him and continued howling in pain. Not knowing what to do, he pulled up the party status screen. Name, Alice. Race. Body, Darkness Mana Body. Level, 317. STR, 335, Dex, 347, Con, 354, Int, 678, WIS, 670. Dulled emotions, void form, insanity. Name, Victor, main body. Race, World Core. Class, Demon Core. Skills. Name, Victor, Avatar. Race, Netherborne. Class, Demon Lord. Level, 905. Stat points, 903 plus million. Life force stable, 10,451 days. Name, Terry. Error, connection lost. Ignoring that the party screen treated his two bodies as separate party members, Victor looked at Alice's debuffs. Void form and insanity were both listed, but he couldn't see the life force debuff he had suffered from. Her stats were also not decreasing, which was both good news and raised questions about why her void form was different from his own. Victor debated using a spell to break her out of her stupor as Mana reacted so aggressively to void creatures, but she seemed in enough pain already. Was it real pain, though? Or was her mind breaking due to the insanity debuff? He returned his attention to Hyveth. In the corner of his vision, he saw the black dragon still in the submissive position. Was that really what he wanted? Hyveth had led to many more profound thoughts on the meaning of life that he didn't appreciate having to think about right now. The other world cores cared little for his morals, and without an army and the power to protect his demon core, his life and everyone associated with him would meet their demise. He simply did not have time to make a political relationship with the dragons. Hyveth Ark's pace, I wish for peace, but that peace requires control. The cursed forest, the land we currently reside in, is now the enemy of the whole world. Only with my death will this end. Hyveth, as a creature outside of the system's influence, would see no logic in his words. She stopped teleporting and glared at him. So your death will save the world? Victor nodded. It would seem so. Mana began pouring toward Hyveth as she looked at him with a wrathful expression. Then so be it, you will die here today. I only have a few years left alive anyways. Trying to kill me is rather brave, but I must point out I am already undead, Victor said with a haunted laugh before vanishing and charging toward Hyveth, claws outstretched and ready to rip her head off. Chapter 74. A Dragon's Trust. Hyveth Ark's pace didn't seem amused by Victor's joke. She glared at him and blinked in disbelief at how such a massive void creature that had loomed over her could instantly vanish. She had seen stealth used many times in her long life, but even when invisible, the opponents would take up some space in reality. She didn't see things in only 3 dimensions. Instead, her inhuman crystal eyes could also see the depression in a gravitational field, allowing her to see invisible targets. But the void creature was gone as if it never existed. A blast of frozen mana assaulted her from behind alongside a gold-tinted claw. Hyveth stepped forward and space folded. She paused and looked back at the void creature over 1,000 meters away. Its head turned to the side, and 6 golden eyes stared at her. It was a bad matchup. The screaming void girl and this creature appeared unaffected by spatial magic as they existed on an alternate plane of reality she couldn't affect with mana-based magic. Perhaps if she had dabbled in void magic, she could stand a chance, but her chances of victory were hopeless with the present situation. Hyveth's fingers twitched with impatience as she bit her lower lip, recalling her encounter with a similar void creature over 1,000 years ago. She remembered that mana-based attacks were ineffective and blades passed harmlessly through its body. The only known weakness was its eyes. But how could she aim for the eyes when the creature vanished into thin air and only reappeared like a reaper aiming for her head? But this one can talk, unlike all the ones previous, she thought as she saw the void creature vanish again. She spread her awareness and had her movement spell at the ready. It speaks of peace, but does it even understand such a concept? Even us dragons struggle to obtain peace in a world full of fighting, yet a creature from the void, destroyer of worlds, claims to know what true peace is and how to achieve it. She snorted. Laughable and ignorant. She suddenly felt a depression in reality behind her again, so she teleported away. Hyveth could keep up the game of cat and mouse forever while she came up with a solution. Her fighting power should be the highest alongside her escaping potential, but when against void creatures, she had to play to her only remaining strength. In the past, the only way to survive these void creatures that were immune to any form of attack was to let them starve. Since it's sentient, unlike the previous ones, maybe I can get more information from it. Hyveth decided to humor the creature. Say, void creature, do you have a name? She asked the empty floor as she assumed the creature was charging toward her. Reality rippled in front of her, and the void creature appeared a few meters away, but its claws were lowered and showed no signs of hostility. I have a human name, but the people of this planet called me Vox. Hyveth raised a brow. The people of this world? Yes, I manage a town of a few thousand humans in the cursed forest. The void creature tilted its head. Unfortunately, the innocent people there have been labeled as subjects of the Demon Lord and now have a system bounty on their heads. Hyveth narrowed her eyes. You run a town? They aren't all undead, right? Some are. I offered the people of my town immortality, but the vast majority are still perfectly alive. Hyveth was confused. The fact this void creature had sentience was already bizarre, but now it was talking about town management and granting people immortality. Was it raising a cult to do its bidding? She should go and investigate. However, there was one other thing the void creature mentioned that didn't make sense. Did those humans of the town give you a human name? Vox shook his head. Nope, I was once a human, so I kept my name from back then. You were? Hyveth had never been flabbergasted in her entire life, but everything coming out of this void creature's mouth was pure nonsense. You were human? How? There was a brief pause. Vox floated there silently, 6 golden eyes staring at her, and he seemed deep in contemplation. Hyveth arcs pace, you say you know what's coming, the destruction of the world. I also know, but only as of today. Vox's words were cryptic and made Hyveth confused. I am no destroyer of worlds, simply a pawn of a higher sentience known as Axon. A year ago, I was but a simple human on another world, one without magic. Vox pointed a claw at his shadowy body. But now I am a human mind trapped in this body, and until today I was blinded by survival and didn't realize I was assisting with the destruction of this world. And now I want to make things right. However, before that, I need to keep my land safe. Why are you telling me all this? Hyveth sneered. Do you really think I will believe such a story? Vox shrugged a strangely human gesture. I can't kill you, and you can't kill me. Fighting doesn't benefit either of us. As we speak, the cursed forest is being consumed and devoured. Everything within has been labeled as an enemy of the world. Through this fighting, the world weakens and leaves itself open to an invasion via the rifts of Axon, something I believe we both wish to avoid. Vox's eyes flashed with intellect. This grand dungeon is now an extension of myself. The ground trembled, causing Hyveth to step back as a column of dirt rose from the ground along with Vox's upward gesture. Through Hyveth's insight, she could tell that it wasn't an external spell cast upon the dungeon such as geokinesis, but rather the dungeon's mana moving to make that possible. Something that wasn't possible unless Vox's words were true. He had become the dungeon. You speak of Axon and these rifts. Hyveth crossed her arms with a teleportation spell primed and ready. Explain more. Axon is a super AI, something you won't understand. But imagine a super-intelligent self-sustaining entity out there in space that requires a lot of mana to stay alive. Only other planets, such as this one, can provide that mana. Vox paused for a moment. For the rifts, I can only speculate, but I assume they will be portals allowing monsters from those dead worlds to come onto this world. Vox pointed to the sky. The world is currently protected by its abundant mana, but as its mana is consumed for spells and fighting, the protection gets weaker. Once the first rifts appear, it will only be a downward spiral as more mana is consumed to defeat them, leading to more rifts opening. Until the world is a lifeless rock in space. Hyveth asked, and Vox nodded at her words. I see. That makes more sense now. She rubbed her chin in thought. Vox did speak some sense, but many of his words needed verifying. She decided to visit his town. But she had a burning question to ask first. What is your plan for the dragons? Vox's golden eyes glowed, and he loomed over Hyveth. Those who obey my rule may live here in the Grand Dungeon and Cursed Forest forever. They can even access the lower dungeon floors, where the mana is dense with every biome imaginable. Hyveth frowned as she thought about the current rulers of this land, the Arkwings. They would never bend knee nor claw to another ruler. And what of those that disobey? They can serve me in death or flee to other lands, Vox said without emotion. I see. Hyveth nodded. May I check on this town you have been managing? Vox shrugged again. Sure, if it will help verify my words. It lies to the far south. I welcome all under my rule, but my rule will be absolute. Hyveth snorted. Although I agree you are rather powerful, the dragons are no pushovers. I am one of 8 ancients. We may be unable to kill you, but remember the strong are only as strong as their weakest link. And with those words, Hyveth vanished. Only strong as my weakest link, such as Necron and the people around me? I never really thought about that. Victor floated there for a while in contemplation, ignoring Alice's screams and her destruction of the surroundings with void spells. He was surprised he had managed to convince Hyveth of his motives. Of course, he knew holding anything back from her would be detrimental, so he may have said more than he should have. But Hyveth Arkspace would be an invaluable ally. Not only was she one of the 8 ancients, but she could send Terry back to Earth. If I gave her the mana of a world core, could she create a portal to Earth? Obviously, if he managed to kill Hyveth and turn her into an undead, he could force her to try, but that was impossible. She was far too good at running away. Victor decided to re-evaluate his plans. He had foolishly thought of the dragons as pushovers after slaughtering so many, but while he was killing the dragons, who was to say an ancient wouldn't eliminate Necron? Or kill Alice? Although Victor had ensured, Alice got as much EXP as possible, and with her void magic, she was stronger than almost everyone in this world. But with ancient dragons and hackers still running around, her life was at risk. Victor sighed as he felt the weight of being an anti-hero bearing down on him. Being constantly hated by those he was trying to save was tough, but he needed to persevere. Then, suddenly, he heard Alice's screams stop. Victor turned and saw the void surrounding Alice had vanished, and she fell roughly to the ground. Her face was pale and haunted, her eyes dull, and her breaths shallow. But she seemed alive, and Victor could see mana pouring toward her. A minute went by, and her complexion began to rapidly improve. She should be fine, he murmured to himself with a sigh of relief. Now, what should I do? Hyveth Arkspace stepped out from a portal and looked around. She rarely came to the lowlands as the mana was so sparse compared to the area closest to the Grand Dungeon that it was almost sickening. She couldn't remain for long, or her strength would start degrading, but it should be fine for a few minutes. Sprawling out for many miles below was a town she had never seen before. There really is a town here. She was very surprised. She had come here a couple years ago while taking one of her many grandchildren on an expedition to capture some prey, and there had been nothing but a monster-infested forest as far as the eye could see. But now, there was a town bustling with activity, and 2 roads stretched out into the distance. However, they were empty. They showed signs of heavy use, but Hyveth couldn't see a single carriage those humans used in sight. Hyveth scrutinized the town. She could feel some death affinity mana in the area, but it wasn't as strong as she expected. Looking to the west, she could detect a large amount of death affinity mana. Stepping through space, she hovered above an open-air mine with undead goblins hard at work. So Vox can micromanage so many undead from so far away. Hyveth found it unbelievable. This is more interesting than I expected. She returned to the town and located the largest and most impressive building, a palace of white stone, which also happened to be the location of the most death affinity mana in the area. With another step, she appeared inside a throne room. The darkness didn't impede her, but she still raised a brow at the hideous sight of a titanic slime monster happily feasting on a human leg. Chapter 75. The Undead of Necron. Hyveth had seen many things throughout her long life that had encapsulated the rise and fall of empires, but a man chopping off his own leg and giving it to the stubby 3-fingered hand of a slime monster was definitely up there as a brow-raising moment. Especially when the man now had no legs. He was just a torso, lying on the floor in a pool of his own blood, but there was a distinct lack of screaming that Hyveth had associated with weak mortals, just a nervous look as if the man was awaiting a miracle. And he was not the only one in the room. Other men and women stood around, and Hyveth noticed a common theme. They were all limping, clutching a severed arm, or had something impaled through their chest. The death mana swirling around the room was almost sickening. They were all undead but seemed oddly conscious and acted like ordinary people. Hyveth was broken from her observations by the sound of the slime burping. "Welcome to Necron. You must be Hyveth Arkspace." The slime spoke to Hyveth as it finished munching on the human leg in a casual tone. Hyveth crossed her arms and tapped her fingers in annoyance. She hated being referred to by such a lowly life form. Only the other ancients would dare speak her name so casually, yet this grey jelly dared? "Did Vox inform you of my arrival?" Hyveth snapped back. The grey slime nodded its weirdly human head. "He did indeed. The name is Andrew, by the way. I am the mayor here." Andrew then gestured to the people in the room. "And these fine people are citizens of our humble town. Well, some of them, at least. Not everyone here in Necron is undead, but these people happen to be." Hyveth ignored the slime and narrowed her eyes at the man on the floor. "Human, why did you chop off your legs?" Despite her long life experience, the act of this man chopping off his own limbs still perplexed her in ways she couldn't describe. The man on the floor gulped as he looked up at the towering woman with a golden horn jutting out her forehead and inhuman crystal eyes. "I had to. My body wouldn't regenerate correctly otherwise." "Regenerate? Yes, I can show you," the man stuttered as he closed his eyes and seemed to activate a skill. Hyveth stepped back in wonder as his leg stumps began to elongate and heal like a wiggling mass of worms made of muscle tissue and blood vessels. Hyveth had sworn the man was a mere mortal without any noticeable amount of mana a second ago, but the mana surging into that spell was immense and seemed to be drawn from the ground rather than the ambient air. She chose to remain silent and mulled over her thoughts as she examined the process, and eventually, she came to a conclusion. Vox was involved somehow. There was no other plausible explanation for a mortal to wield such power, unless the system assisted the man? Once the man's legs healed, Hyveth asked a question. "So you are an undead? Why couldn't you heal your leg without chopping it off?" She had seen undead that could regenerate. Although the speed of this regeneration was absurd, it wasn't an impossibility. It was a little hard to look at, but the man stood up with two perfectly smooth and spotless legs starkly contrasting to his callous hands and sun-kissed skin that showed a lifetime of hard labor. Luckily his shredded trousers covered up the important bit. The man jumped up and down and tested his new legs. A wide grin that missed a few teeth formed on his face. Good as new. He seemed like an excited kid on his birthday, and Hyveth simply couldn't wrap her head around the situation, and she needed to fast. Her time on the lowlands was running out, and the lack of mana was slowly poisoning her. "Mortal, answer my question." Hyveth's cold voice made the man freeze up. "My time is short here, and I need answers, otherwise, I'm destroying everything before I leave. I can't let a nest of corrupted fester for too long." The man waved his hands. Wait. Miss Arkspace, I am simply doing what everyone else here is doing. When Vox granted those that died in the Empire's raid immortality, he revived us. But it came with some issues." "Revived you? Impossible. That is forbidden magic," Hyveth said resolutely. "Only necromancy can somewhat imitate such a feat depending on the caster's domain over death." She let her words hang, and she furrowed her brows. Now that she thought about it, from the little she had seen of Necron, Vox was the best darn necromancer she had ever seen. "No way he discovered that magic," Hyveth muttered to herself but was interrupted by the man clearing his throat. "Ahem, I don't believe Vox used such a spell on us, although I must admit I am no mage but the system says I am a preserved corpse instead of a human now, and I gained a few skills that I can activate, such as regeneration. Again, I'm no expert, but that sounds like necromancy to me." Hyveth looked around the room. "Same for all of you." Everyone nodded while shrinking back under the woman's intense glare. Hyveth frowned. "That still doesn't explain why you had to chop your legs off. Also, I have never heard of a preserved corpse race of undead before. It was unbelievable, but had Vox created his own type of undead never before seen in the world? She was starting to worry that Vox might be far more dangerous than he was letting on. The other Netherborne she had witnessed over the years could use necromancy, but it was very basic, nothing so unique as creating a town or a sentient undead that looked so alive, like the man standing before her. The man coughed into his hand and replied, "The reason I had to cut my legs off is that the regeneration skill would only heal new wounds, not the wounds I acquired before I was turned into an undead." Then, as if to iterate his point, he slashed his hand with a knife, leaving a deep incision. "I am once again glad I am now numb to pain," the man muttered as he activated his regeneration skill, and the deep wound in his hand knitted itself together. The man turned his hand around and showed another scar right next to the cut he had just healed. "I got this scar from a farming accident when I was young. Unfortunately, as you can see, the regeneration skill didn't remove the scar of this injury. But if I was to cut my entire hand off..." Hyveth didn't flinch as the man raised a machete and chopped his hand off with a grunt. Blood splashed onto the floor, and the hand fell to the marble floor. The large, undead ogre standing beside Andrew, who had remained deathly still this entire time, bent forward, scooped up the cut hand from the floor, and handed it to the slime, who was happy to eat it like a snack. The man didn't seem in pain, but he looked deathly pale and kept his eyes locked onto the ceiling, clearly trying to avoid peeking at his handless arm. Once again, a hand was created from wriggling flesh within seconds. Flexing his new hand, the man brought it up for Hyveth to see. Look here, Miss Hyveth, my hand that has seen a lifetime of labor is now smoother than those noble brats from the Empire." A frown formed on the man's face. "Why does my hand look so girly now?" Hyveth ignored the man's remarks and tapped her finger on her chin. The man was clearly sentient, capable of complex speech, thoughts, and could take actions based on the situation without direct command from the necromancer. Of course, there was always the chance that Vox was puppeteering this entire thing from the void, but she doubted it. "So you still have access to the system?" The man nodded. "Indeed, I even have my old farmer class, and it seems I can still gain levels." Hyveth knew a decent amount about the system, despite having never been a part of it. Knowledge was power, and Hyveth had acquired more knowledge about the workings of this world than anyone else in an apparently vain attempt to stop it from succumbing to whatever threat had decimated those distant stars. However, Hyveth now knew the incoming threat, she had even met the person that had caused it. Vox was clearly not only a selfish creature but also a downright stubborn one. But he was also correct. Even though he was the one to start the spiral of destruction, the invasion of this world was only inevitable, something she had come to terms with a long time ago. But Hyveth had something those dead stars floating in the vast expanse of space likely never had, a pawn of Axon offering assistance to combat the more significant threat. So wouldn't she be foolish to dismiss the outstretched hand? Hyveth paused. Who was to say the other worlds hadn't encountered the same thing? What if she was just playing right into Axon's hands by thinking one of its pawns was on her side? Deciding to clear her head, Hyveth stepped forward and teleported above Necron. Despite the ominous red beacon looming in the distance, casting its scarlet light on the town, the people seemed cheerful. Undead walked alongside the living, a mother strolled below with her husband. They were linking arms and talking about the future. One Hyveth thought sounded rather bright. They spoke of climbing the noble ladder and creating an eternal bloodline in their name. Something about being the immortal heads of a family syndicate seemed to fascinate the man, and the wife just seemed happy to have her husband back from the dead, giggling at his every word and practically having stars in her eyes. Hyveth could relate to those thoughts as the head of the Arkspace family and a supposed near-immortal dragon herself. But immortality was only so pleasing when you had others to share it with. What use was being the last one alive in a dead world? That was a future she wished to avoid at all costs. Even if it involved working alongside a creature from the void that might backstab her. Hyveth looked at the skyline with a lonely feeling and an impossible weight on her shoulders. Should she trust in a void creature's words that had gained more validity with her visit to Necron? Maybe I should accept his offer. She spoke to the setting sun. So long as the dragons remain alive, we can take back what is ours if it gets too out of hand. Although it would involve waking him up. She shuddered. If only that old dragon wasn't so fond of sleep, we might have been able to avoid this entire situation. Hyveth let out a long sigh. She had faced Vox in combat and mostly confirmed his strengths and weaknesses. Vox was definitely strong, a threat to take seriously, but he was not as immortal as he may believe. The Arkwings had been in power for so long for a good reason. Nobody could obliterate void creatures like the Arkwings Ancient, who wielded star mana, the natural counter to the void. It's just waking up a walking calamity like that a century early is an easy way to have your entire bloodline exterminated. Hyveth chuckled sadly and shook her head. Taking one last look at the setting sun, she made her decision. It was time to make a deal with the Vox. We are now caught up to the web novel and will upload as the chapters upload with 5 to 10 chapters per video. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment on which web novel you want next.